One World Trade Center, New York City. Friday, February 26, 1993. The basement garage was a scene of utter destruction, cloaked in thickening smoke. A woman alone, trapped and bleeding, called police. There were many panicked calls to the NYPD that day as real life took on the trappings of a disaster movie.
Terrorist bombings are what happen in other countries, not here in the United States. And yet, in 1993, it happened in New York City. The World Trade Center bombing rattled our notion of domestic security. It shook the foundation of our belief that we're not vulnerable to terrorism. The cracks it caused in our self-confidence can never be repaired. If it happened once, could it happen again? It was the question in everyone's mind, but no one dared to say it aloud. I'm Jim Kellstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Somewhere in a crater, 5 stories deep, in wreckage a block wide, lay the key to the bomber's identity. At least, that's what investigators hoped.
At 12:18 p.m. on February 26, 1993, panic and confusion gripped the 110-story World Trade Center Tower 1. People were trapped in elevators. Lights went out. Smoke turned the hallways black. Thousands of the injured and panicked occupants choked as they tried blindly to escape what seemed like a nightmare. The engineer who designed the towers anticipated several potential disasters. He structurally designed them to withstand the violence of a sustained hurricane and something as unimaginable as the impact of a fully fueled jet.
Let's go!
It seemed that something had been overlooked, but no one knew what. On that day, Tower 1 became the city's tallest chimney. The stairwells acted as flues, drawing smoke up from the basement, blackening every floor. In the first chaotic hours, all officials knew for sure was that the cause of the problem was in the basement garage. Neil Herman, supervisor of the Joint Terrorist Task Force at the FBI's New York office, was just blocks away from the Trade Center. Unaware of the cause of the mayhem, the FBI took it upon themselves to respond.
Initially, we felt, and we were told, that it was possibly a fire or transformer. Within a few minutes, it became apparent from the traffic on the police channels that there was something there more than just a fire or some kind of an accident. And I dispatched, along with myself, members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force down to the World Trade Center.
The immediate concern was getting the trapped victims out of the building. Extensive damage created logistical problems for rescue workers. Many of those inside struggled to make their own way to safety. The elevators had broken down, and those on the top floor had to walk down 110 flights. There were tremendous injuries due to smoke inhalation. As hundreds of emergency personnel continued their rescue efforts, FBI agents dispatched to the Trade Center were scouring the area for any indication of what may have caused the devastation. The destruction was massive. The city streets around the complex were buckling. The Vista Hotel, which rests between the two towers, had sustained tremendous amounts of damage. It was immediately apparent to investigators that whatever occurred below the street level was powerful enough to come up through 4 levels of the parking garage, up to the street and higher. Special Agent Chuck Stern of the FBI's counterterrorism branch began the process of organizing the investigation.
It started to look like it might be an explosion, a criminal explosion. I would say maybe within an hour of the blast. And then, of course, more and more information kept coming back. You know, we had our special agent bomb technicians from the FBI were down there and, you know, working with the bomb squad from the city police department, and you know, they were reaching the same conclusion that, you know, this is what it appeared to be.
By early that evening, 200 agents and lab personnel from the explosives unit at FBI headquarters were flown in to assist the hundreds of ATF and NYPD bomb squad technicians already at the scene. Locating survivors and getting them out was the only concern. The rescue effort was largely focused in the garage area. As they slowly made their way through the wreckage, rescue workers were shocked and relieved to find survivors. As they moved onward, they reached an area that had sustained massive destruction. FBI, ATF, and NYPD bomb technicians had suited up in protective gear to aid in the search. Some carried thermal imaging cameras to scan for bodies trapped in the rubble. The discoveries became more gruesome. 6 people had been found dead. Among the dead was John DiGiovanni, a dental supply salesman who had parked his car in the underground lot. Robert Kirkpatrick, William Mako, Stephen Knapp, and Monica Smith were also killed. They'd worked for a company that provided maintenance to the World Trade Center. Monica was pregnant with her first child. Wilfredo Mercado, an employee last seen unloading a van in the garage, was found dead, buried under 12 feet of concrete. Inside the garage was an apocalyptic scene. Debris and concrete were scattered 100 yards in all directions. Hundreds of cars had been demolished, and small fires erupted from spilled gasoline. Pumps drained a flood of water and sewage from broken pipes. Overhead, 6 tons of concrete clung to warped rebars. Fiber optic cables dangled. To FBI agents, there was no way that the cause of this damage was accidental. Special Agent Chris Ronay from the FBI Laboratories Explosives Unit surveyed the damage.
Well, as we analyzed the damage to the building, even in the early stages, it was clear that there was a very large bomb, a very large explosive device of some hundreds of pounds. It was clear from the beginning. We didn't know how big it was. Placed in the basement on one of the parking garage levels, most likely in a vehicle.
If the agent's initial conclusions were correct, this was the single greatest act of terrorism on American soil at that time. The morning after the explosion, interagency teams prepared for their first extended glimpse of the destruction. In addition to the ongoing search for victims, they were now looking for any clue that could explain the explosion. But they were explicitly instructed not to move any evidence. The structural integrity at the lower levels was severely weakened. Any disturbance might cause what little support there was remaining to collapse on those inside. The floor of the B2 level of the garage had collapsed, sending hundreds of cars from 3 parking levels down several stories. All the vehicles came to rest at the bottom level, crushing the tower's refrigeration room.
Actually, the engineers told us that that debris that was piled around the columns, sort of like a soda straw stuck into a pile of sand. And you couldn't remove the debris because that would remove what little support was present, and it was holding the Vista Hotel up.
Construction crews spent hours reinforcing the walls and columns in the parking levels so that agents and investigators could safely explore the scene. After several hours, agents and technicians began to make their way into the blast area.
It was very, very eerie because it was deserted, and there were a lot of cars with the trunks blown open and things like that. And some of them you could hear ticking because which was kind of an eerie thing at a bomb site, because the turn signals had been activated and were actually still flashing on some of the cars.
Gradually, the searchers got closer to the origin of the blast, known as Ground Zero. The damage was so extensive that there was no conclusive evidence that pointed to the cause of the explosion. The floors were completely blown away, leaving a 5-story crater which extended through the cavity of the building. Investigators searching for explosive residues had difficulty finding them. They were mixed in with concrete debris and building materials. They had to sift through tons of dirt and rubble in the hope of finding some scrap of evidence. Hundreds of damaged vehicles were swabbed and vacuumed in search of residues. Agents persisted. Somewhere in the devastation were answers. As the images of the World Trade Center bombing were broadcast around the nation, people reacted with horror and disbelief. America's innocence had been shattered. The United States joined the list of countries hardened by terrorist attacks. Desperate to catch the bombers, the city placed a bounty on their heads, $200,000, the largest in city history. By Saturday morning, the FBI had set up a command post specifically for this investigation. Every available agent was assigned to the case. They had received hundreds of leads. Most were callers who described suspicious neighbors. Numerous groups had phoned in to claim responsibility. Though most of these leads appeared to be dead ends, they all had to be pursued. Just 2 days after the blast, as agents chased down leads, investigators processing the crime scene spotted a piece of charred, twisted steel at what was thought to be the center of the explosion. It was part of a vehicle decimated by the blast. Perhaps from the vehicle that delivered the bomb.
VIN number here.
Investigators noticed a series of digits stamped onto the metal debris. Though they were explicitly instructed not to remove evidence, they felt their finding was significant enough to override protocol. The metal debris was loaded onto a stretcher and hoisted up to the top of the crater. Once it was on the surface, agents rushed the finding to a forensics laboratory set up by the NYPD crime lab. In the lab, agents and examiners were having difficulty determining what the markings meant. An investigator from the FBI's Joint Autocrime Task Force was called to examine the debris.
I think it's 729.
His analysis would provide the first major break of the investigation. He called Special Agent Stern immediately.
He says, "Chuck, I looked at this and I said to the person who was showing it to me, 'My man, you don't know what you have here. This is a confidential vehicle identification number.'"
Confidential VIN numbers are as unique to a particular automobile as fingerprints are to a person. The hidden number allows law enforcement to determine if a particular vehicle has been stolen. It also gives investigators detailed information about the vehicle, including who owns the car. Within 15 minutes, investigators were able to enter the confidential number into the National Crime Information Center computer, which lists all vehicles that have been reported stolen. A response quickly came back. The number belonged to a Ford Econoline van that had been reported stolen from DIB Leasing in Jersey City, New Jersey. The FBI's Newark office was contacted immediately. Within minutes, agents arrived at DIB. The FBI was prepared to uncover everyone or anything that had access to that van.
That this Ford Econoline van was, in fact, a Ryder rental van that had been rented by an individual by the name of Mohammed Salameh, and then later reported stolen. And they learned from the management of DIB Leasing that Salameh had put down a $400 deposit on the van, and that he had been anxiously trying to get the deposit back.
After conferring with federal prosecutors late into the evening on Wednesday, the decision was made to have an undercover FBI agent in place at DIB when Salameh returned for his deposit the next morning. They spent the remainder of the evening piecing together Salameh's history. They learned that Mohammed Salameh was a 25-year-old immigrant of Palestinian descent. He had come to the attention of authorities as a vocal supporter of Muslim fundamentalist El Said Nosser, whose scathing opposition to the Israeli, Egyptian, and United States governments was no secret. The undercover agent was posing as a Ryder representative, stating to Salameh that he needed more information about the theft of the van before refunding the deposit. After some discussion, Salameh walked out with the $400. As he stepped out of the office, dozens of FBI agents who had been monitoring their discussion descended upon Salameh. Less than 1 week after the bombing, the FBI had a suspect in custody. Salameh said little to the agents who questioned him about the bombing. They knew it was probable that he had not acted alone. The investigation was taking on a clearer focus. When Salameh was arrested, agents recovered various personal items, including his wallet, which contained several business cards and telephone numbers. They began by searching the address listed on his driver's license. A former roommate told agents that Salameh no longer lived at that address. However, they were able to find some belongings of Salameh's that he had left behind. There were news clippings and photos relating to Nosser, and a photo of him and Nosser together. There were numerous bank records. There were also more names and numbers for investigators to pursue.
We were able to obtain addresses. We were able to obtain telephone numbers. We were able to have pen registers where we were able to monitor phone calls, calls coming in and going out. And once that started, again, it opened up the floodgates.
Investigators were also receiving help from the public. A few days after Salameh's arrest, the manager of the space station storage facility in Jersey City called the FBI. Individuals who rented Unit 4344 had received several deliveries from chemical companies just prior to the Trade Center blast. The manager ordered a key and opened the unit. Inside, he found what he thought to be bomb-making paraphernalia. FBI agents would reach the same conclusion. Inside, investigators found several compounds which could be used for making explosives. Their findings were sent to the FBI lab for analysis. There were also many other leads that emerged from the search of the storage facility. Receipts for the chemicals, bank and phone records, and an unexpected bonus, a log of the suspect's comings and goings. To enter the facility, each tenant was required to punch in their special access code on a keypad located at the entrance. Each time a tenant punched in his number, it was recorded in a computer system. Agents could determine each time Unit 4344 was accessed. Meanwhile, police assembled a lineup. Doug Melvin, manager of the space station, identified Mohammed Salameh as the man who rented the locker. He recognized him easily because Salameh frequently visited his storage locker. In Melvin's experience, customers usually had no reason to do that. Continuing to search for any possible lead, agents obtained phone records from a payphone just outside the storage facility. One name on the list of individuals who received calls from that phone was already familiar to the FBI. That name was Nidal Ayyad. Nidal Ayyad's name first appeared on a business card found inside Salameh's wallet. Eyad worked as a chemical engineer. Within a week of Salameh's arrest, agents learned Eyad had called a chemical company inquiring about buying chemicals. The prospect of another bomb was frighteningly real. It appeared that another act of violence was in the making. Agents felt they had sufficient information to obtain a warrant for Ayad's arrest. On March 10th, the FBI raided his home in New Jersey as he and his family ate dinner. After searching his home, agents quickly made their way to his place of business, Allied Chemical. There they confiscated phone records and bank statements that could tie him to Salameh. The most irrefutable link between Eyad and the bomb plot, however, came from Ayad's business computer. It was seized and then thoroughly examined.
Our technical people were able to restore an erased file, which turned out to be a letter claiming credit for the World Trade Center bombing on behalf of an organization known as the Liberation Army 5th Battalion.
A similar letter had been sent to the New York Times 4 days after the explosion. In it, the group called the bombing an act of terrorism to protest American support for Israel. There was also a second letter Eyad hadn't had time to send. It promised another blast. Though the investigation was progressing very quickly, each new discovery revealed the existence of a large and ongoing conspiracy. The potential for more attacks grew more likely every day. As the FBI tried to learn more from their prime suspects in the World Trade Center bombing, Salameh and Eyad continued to stonewall their efforts. Analysis of all the confiscated phone records led investigators to an apartment in Jersey City. The landlord who owned the apartment at 40 Pamrapo Avenue confirmed that Salameh and another individual rented the apartment from early January of 1993 until the end of February, just 2 months later. The landlord could not confirm the identity of Salameh's roommate, whose name he knew only as Rashid. Most likely, that name was an alias. A search warrant was quickly issued. After executing the warrant, agents discovered that 40 Pamrapo Avenue was the bomb factory, the place where the conspirators mixed an explosive powerful enough to rock the World Trade Center. Inside the apartment and an adjacent garage, FBI forensic examiners recovered traces of a diverse range of chemicals. These items were collected and then rushed to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. While agents searched the apartment, the identity of Salameh's mysterious roommate emerged. They found papers requesting political asylum in the name of Ramzi Yousef, who, according to the documents, had been detained in September of 1992 at Kennedy Airport for entering the country without a visa. The Pamrapo Avenue apartment was a gold mine for the FBI.
All right, let's go. Go ahead and tell us what happened.
Before they learned of the apartment, the FBI's laboratory examiners could only speculate from residue samples taken at the Trade Center that the bomb used was comprised of the highly explosive compound urea nitrate. The discovery of the bomb factory at Pamrapo Avenue, however, made them certain. From the labs at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Special Agent Ronay reported the findings.
From the analyses in the laboratory, we concluded that it was made with urea nitrate, a homemade explosive mixture. There's no such commercial product. So they had to mix this themselves. And when we finally located the storehouse or workshop where they did make the bomb, this was confirmed. These materials or remnants of them were available and confirmed that this is what we were indeed seeing in the laboratory in these residues.
Witness interviews and phone record analysis continued, directed mainly at the locations where key elements of the conspiracy had taken place. All of those interviewed mentioned seeing a distinctive-looking individual in the company of Salameh and Ramzi Yousef. Phone records helped to identify that individual as Mahmud Abouhalima. As agents focused their investigation on Abu Halima, they learned that shortly after the bombing, he had fled the country. Abu Halima was well known to authorities through his association with El Said Nosser. Abu Halima was also close to the radical Muslim cleric Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who would later be sentenced to life in prison for a conspiracy to bomb several New York City landmarks. Soon after agents learned that Abu Halima had fled the country, Egyptian authorities contacted the FBI to say that he'd been arrested and detained in Cairo. Abu Halima had been wanted there for conspiring against Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Negotiations between the United States and Egyptian governments were successful. Agents flew to Egypt and took Abu Halima into FBI custody. When he was turned over to FBI agents, his hands were cuffed, and his head was entirely covered. He told the FBI that he thought he was being taken out to be shot. Relieved to now be in their custody, he spoke to agents on the flight back to New York.
He did make several statements that were used against him at trial. One of the key things that he said was, about Rashid, who was later determined to be an alias used by Ramzi Yousef.
Abu Halima told Stern that he and Yousef had met in Afghanistan at a secret camp for the Mujahideen Muslim freedom fighters, a training ground for international terrorists. At every step of the investigation, Ramzi Yousef's name appeared. He was a known international terrorist and an expert with explosives. Agents now believed he was the mastermind behind the World Trade Center bombing. The FBI began searching for Yousef. They soon learned that he fled the country the night of the Trade Center bombing. An international manhunt for Ramzi Yousef had begun. In the meantime, agents were trying to determine how and when Yousef came to the United States. It's been said that the day Ramzi Yousef arrived on American soil was the day terrorism came to America. On September 1st, 1992, the shadowy Afghan-trained master bomb maker arrived at New York's Kennedy Airport. The FBI's close scrutiny of the passenger manifest from Yousef's flight that day revealed another clue. He had not entered the country alone in September of 1992. With him was Ahmad Ajaj. But Ajaj had been detained by customs agents for producing a false Swedish passport. In Ajaj's suitcase, customs agents found a library of manuals on bomb making and guerrilla warfare. The suitcase was confiscated, and Ajaj was arrested and jailed for passport fraud. To the FBI, Ajaj appeared to be an unlikely conspirator. He had been incarcerated from September of 1992 through the bombing of the Trade Center in February of 1993. Fortunately for agents, prison policy required that all phone conversations be recorded. Ajaj had unwittingly left a trail, and agents quickly followed it.
And we began to see that he was, through various methods, predominantly through three-way calling, where he would call another individual, and then that individual would forward the calls. He was staying in contact with the other conspirators, and was in fact trying to assist them in completing their mission of building this bomb.
Ajaj was questioned by FBI agents about his contacts and his knowledge of the bombing. He said little. His silence was not enough to prevent FBI agents from arresting and charging him in connection with the bombing. With 4 conspirators now in custody, authorities decided to bring them to trial while the search for other bombers continued. In September of 1993, 6 months after the bombing of the World Trade Center, Salameh, Eyad, Abu Halima, and Ajaj appeared in federal court in New York City.
By the time that the trial started in September of 1993, we really had to have 2 investigations in one. We had to have an investigation basically continuing to identify those responsible, locate those that were also charged that were fugitives, and also prepare for a 6-month trial that ultimately ended in March of 1994.
By this time, examiners had processed numerous crime scenes. The World Trade Center, the storage facility, and the bomb factory. 70% of the van that delivered the bomb had been collected. There was also a mass of receipts, phone records, and interviews. Tons of evidence had been recovered. It would now be up to a jury to determine if it was enough. By September of 1993, 6 months after the bombing, federal prosecutors were ready to present to a jury how the defendants carried out the bombing of the World Trade Center. The conspiracy began soon after Ramzi Yousef arrived in America in September of 1992. He moved in with Salameh, and the two became close friends. The friendship was founded on a mutual hatred of Israel and a desire to disrupt U.S. support of the Israeli government. They chose the World Trade Center as the stage for articulating their political agenda. The World Trade Towers are the city's tallest buildings, rising a quarter-mile above the pavement. In addition to the 2 towers, the complex includes the Vista Hotel, numerous underground shopping areas, and entrances to the subway lines that connect New York and New Jersey. Below that are 5 parking levels, each level containing more offices and businesses. The terrorists decided the bomb could cause the most damage, claim the most lives, by being placed in the garage. The plan was put into effect. Receipts showed that in November, Yousef used an alias to buy chemicals. Throughout the winter, he would order more as he honed the formula for his bomb and worked out the plan of attack.
Where are the exits?
The chemicals were delivered to space station storage. Salameh or Yousef would sign for them, using aliases to make sure that no paper trail could lead to them. Yousef was desperate for the bomb-making manuals and Ajaj's confiscated luggage. Yousef developed a clever three-way calling system to hide the trail from Ajaj's prison phone in New York City to his New Jersey apartment. First, Yousef called a burger stand in Dallas, Texas, where his friend Eyad Ismoil worked. Then Ismoil called Ajaj as Yousef waited on the other line.
Get them here. No. Look.
When Ajaj answered the phone in prison,
Everything is
Ismoil connected him with Yousef.
Ajaj, how are you doing?
Together, the three were able to discuss the bomb's construction.
I don't have the plans.
The jury was methodically being shown the lengths to which the bombers had gone to protect themselves. These bombers would not be deterred. The prosecutors continued. One winter afternoon, the bombers' plot stalled. Salameh and Yousef were driving back from Abu Halima's New Jersey home when Salameh lost control of his car. He suffered only minor injuries. Yousef was more seriously hurt. He was hospitalized for a week. Yousef made calls to chemical companies from his hospital bed. The FBI learned who he called and when through hospital phone records. As Yousef recuperated, Salameh, Eyad, and Abu Halima drove deep into the Pennsylvania woods. Here they tested a prototype of their deadly mixture. It exploded, but it needed more power. So in the coming days, Eyad would attempt to buy compressed hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is so commonly used in Middle Eastern terrorist bombings that it's considered a signature. Even though Eyad worked as a chemical engineer, he had problems finding a company that would sell it to him. On February 16th, the chemist Eyad rented a car to scout the World Trade Center. Salameh's fingerprints on the wheel revealed that he drove. His prints were also on the parking ticket for the garage's B2 level. A sketch found later showed Eyad had made a rough drawing of the floor plan. Then, just 4 days before the bombing, at Yousef's request, Eyad Ismoil arrived in New York from Dallas to help complete the bomb making. Ismoil would also drive the vehicle carrying the bomb into the garage. He was Yousef's trusted friend, and he had been a New York City cab driver. Perfect credentials for this delicate operation. On February 23rd, Salameh went to DIB Leasing and rented a 10-foot Ford Econoline panel van. He left a cash deposit of $400. Construction of the bomb was nearly complete. There was one more reconnaissance visit to the World Trade Center garage. In a burgundy Chevy Corsica rented by Eyad, with Salameh listed as the second driver, the conspirators returned to the garage with Yousef and Ismoil to determine the precise location for placing the bomb. Jurors were shown another garage claim ticket that confirmed the time of the visit, the make of the car, and the garage level they parked on, the B2 level. Meanwhile, Eyad had managed to reach a firm that would sell him compressed hydrogen. He ordered 3 large tanks, which were delivered to the space station storage the next day. On February 25th at the Pamrapo apartment, Abu Halima and the others carefully mixed sulfuric and nitric acid with glycerin into the deadly and volatile substance nitroglycerin. They mixed an estimated 1,200 pounds of urea crystals with several gallons of nitric acid. They poured it into big metal drums where it formed a gel-like mass. They transferred the urea nitrate mass into plastic trash cans. The others had backed the van down the driveway behind the house and up to the apartment door. They packed the cargo hold with their creation, a lethal cocktail of chemicals, bonding agent, fuse, and detonator. They loaded the trash cans and then arranged the home-brewed nitroglycerin among them. They had threaded 4 long fuses through surgical tubing to reduce the smoke and slow the burn enough for the bombers to escape. The fuses were rigged to blasting caps and boxes of gunpowder, and then inserted into each of the nitro containers. All that was missing was the hydrogen, which was used to make the blast even more devastating. In the Ryder van, followed by Ayad's Corsica, they drove to the space station to pick up the hydrogen. They loaded it carefully in the van, propping the 3 red tanks behind the boxes of nitro against the rear doors. Yousef and Ismoil drove the van from New Jersey to a hotel in Manhattan. Hotel records showed that Ismoil had reserved a room for the night on February 25th. They parked it out back for the night, hidden from view. At 10 that evening, from his home in Jersey City, Salameh informed New Jersey police that the van had been stolen. He spun a story about parking it at a grocery store and coming out to find it gone. Later that night, he met with police to document the loss. He knew he would need a valid police report if he was going to get his deposit back. Agents learned that Salameh had purchased a child's airline ticket abroad because it was all he could afford. He needed the van deposit back so he could upgrade the ticket to an adult fare. With the vehicle having been reported stolen, everything was in place. The bombers took their last drive to the World Trade Center. At about 2 minutes past noon the next day, Friday, February 26, 1993, the bombers' Ryder van pulled into the B2 level ramp of the World Trade Center. The burgundy Corsica followed. Ismoil drove the van as Yousef sat in the passenger seat. Pulled the van into a space normally occupied by a New York Port Authority van. Since Port Authority owns the World Trade Center, their vehicles have easy access in and out of the garage. The getaway car waited nearby. One of the men held a cigarette lighter against the fuse. As it began to burn, they rushed to the Corsica and pulled away. The flames raced along, an inch every 2.5 seconds, silent and almost smoke-free because of the surgical tubing. The gunpowder was packed into Atlas Rockmaster blasting caps, the kind used in the demolition of large building sites. 4 fuses were used to guarantee the bomb would detonate. Yousef, Ismoil, and the others exited the garage a few seconds before the blast. At 12:18 p.m., the months of planning this destruction was about to become a reality. The explosion hit the wall of the tower with a massive force, destroying everything around it. Later that day, as rescue workers and investigators were still responding to the scene, Yousef sat safely aboard an airplane to Pakistan, and Ismoil aboard a plane to Jordan. Within days, Abu Halima had also fled. If investigators had not found and tracked the VIN number so quickly, Salameh would likely have escaped too. Over the course of the 6-month trial, the jury heard from 206 witnesses and reviewed a total of 10,000 pages of testimony. In February of 1994, a year after the bombing, the trial concluded. It took the jury just 3 days to reach a verdict. The jury forewoman read off 38 pronouncements of guilty: conspiracy, explosive destruction of property, interstate transportation of explosives, and murder. When she finished, the courtroom erupted. Eyad and Salameh leapt up, screaming the verdict was an injustice. Only Abu Halima had remained silent. He sat calmly, arms folded, with a bemused smile on his face. 3 months after their convictions, on May 24, 1994, Judge Kevin Duffy sentenced each bomber to a year in prison for each year of life he had deprived the victims. It came to 240 years apiece, with no possibility of parole. Sentencing went on for hours, with each defendant making a lengthy speech. Mohammed Salameh, the chemist Nidal Ayyad, Ahmad Ajaj, the man who brought the bomb manuals into the country, and Mahmud Abouhalima, known as the Red, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Though the trial of the 4 defendants was a success, the mastermind Ramzi Yousef and his accomplice Eyad Ismoil were still fugitives. 4 of the 6 conspirators in the World Trade Center bombing had been convicted. But the FBI still sought the mastermind of the bombing. As the search for Ramzi Yousef and his accomplice Eyad Ismoil continued, agents learned that Yousef was involved in several terrorist plots designed to bring down commercial airliners worldwide. Advisories were issued to American travelers abroad. More terrorist attacks on Americans or American interests were likely following the verdict. Yousef was one of the most dangerous and elusive men in the world.
Subsequent to the World Trade Center incident, it's obvious and apparent that he was planning additional acts of terrorism around the world. The air conspiracy case certainly reveals that the extent of what was being planned, the fact that he was moving around throughout the world, several countries, indicates a wide range of support that he and his compatriots had.
It was not until February of 1995, 2 years after the Trade Center bomb went off, that Ramzi Yousef was apprehended in Pakistan and turned over to FBI agents. Agent Stern was sent to retrieve Yousef and bring him back. Yousef was suddenly willing to talk. His hatred for the United States and its aid to Israel was all-consuming. He told Stern that the World Trade Center was chosen as his target because it was the greatest symbol of American finance and imperialism.
He felt that it was kind of like a state of war. He compared it to the United States atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Where he said 250,000 people were killed, and he felt that if he could topple one of the towers into the other, he would kill that many people, and it was a similar type act.
The final arrest came 6 months later, in June of 1995. Eyad Ismoil was discovered and apprehended in Jordan. He too was returned to the United States to stand trial for his role in the bombing. Yousef and Ismoil were tried together in New York City. In January of 1998, after being found guilty of the same 38 charges that the other defendants had faced, a judge sentenced the two to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge, calling Yousef an apostle of evil, ruled that Yousef should serve the remainder of his life in solitary confinement. Only a life of solitude could prevent Yousef from conspiring to kill again. With the major conspirators imprisoned for life, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have had a chance to reflect on the magnitude of this investigation.
Well, the World Trade Center case really, in many ways, was a real wake-up call for law enforcement. It was the largest single act of international terrorism in the country. And although terrorism has been here for many years, certainly on the scope that we saw the World Trade Center was something that was unique and certainly much more horrific than we've seen in the past.
The bombers did $550 million worth of destruction to the World Trade Center. The financial damage caused by the disruption of national and international business was also deeply felt. America had been jolted from its belief that international terrorist attacks don't happen on American soil. By bringing such a complex and far-reaching conspiracy to a close so quickly, the FBI sent a message around the world. The taking of innocent lives will never be tolerated. In the 1990s, a close-knit immigrant community was terrorized by one of its own. Those who turned to the police for help found themselves threatened or killed. Despite the risk, two men refused to back down. Their testimony could help end the killing if the FBI got close enough to uncover one man's deadly business.
Many immigrants escaped the poverty of India to start new lives in the United States. Most dream of a better life for their families. One twisted the American dream into a nightmare. When people started turning up dead in New York's Indian community, law enforcement struggled to link fraud and murder to one powerful man. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When the promise of the American dream was shattered by murder and corruption, the FBI provided hope to those people who had seen their lives and families torn apart.
July 9th, 1995. Gas station attendant Kulwant Singh commuted to a gas station in the Bronx to work the late shift. Less than a year earlier, he had arrived in New York from a poor town in India, hoping to make a better life for himself and his family. That night, he disappeared. In October, the missing man's brother, Manmohan Singh, traveled to the U.S. to find him. He hadn't heard from his brother in months. It wasn't like him not to write or call. He began his search in Queens at the address of one of his brother's friends. His name was Satyendra Singh. His family was from the same village as the missing attendants. Although this friend had the same last name, he was not related. Like many members of the Sikh religion, Satyendra took the surname Singh, which means lion in the Punjabi language. Satyendra said a missing persons report had been filed, but police had found no trace of his friend. He advised the new arrival to be careful who he talked to. Searching for the brother would be dangerous. Manmohan visited the gas station in the Bronx where his brother had worked. He spoke to an attendant, but the man was afraid to respond.
My brother's missing. I'm sorry. I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him?
His supervisor made it clear that no one should be asking questions. The employee was instructed to keep quiet. But Manmohan was persistent and convinced the attendant to meet him at a diner a few days later.
I can only be here for a few minutes. I know you're looking for him.
The attendant said the missing brother had been accused of stealing from the gas station.
And he was coming in to cover.
Whether or not the allegations were true, they had made the station's owner angry. The attendant believed Manmohan's brother had been kidnapped and probably killed. By March of 1997, a year and a half after his brother's abduction, Manmohan took a job at a gas station in New York. He worked nights so he could spend his days secretly gathering information. He believed he knew who was responsible and was ready to go to the police.
Here, I need some oil.
Then, on the night of March 16, 1997, he was silenced. Brooklyn North homicide detectives received a call from a customer who found the body.
105, 1025.
They photographed the crime scene to record its condition, then gathered evidence. They collected 2 shell casings from a 9mm Ruger. Detectives found the register had been robbed, but were surprised that the thief had left some cash behind. Police also found no fingerprints. Detective Tony Brizada concluded that robbery was not the prime motive.
We examined the scene, and it looked like it was a typical gas station robbery at the beginning, but then examining the scene thoroughly, it seemed that it was more like an assassination, or this person was a target because he was shot very close range behind the head, and he was on his knees.
Detectives visited the Sikh temple where the funeral was being held. They knew this immigrant community was wary of outsiders, but hoped to find friends of the victim willing to talk.
Good, how you doing?
Satyendra Singh stepped forward. He told detectives that he knew the slain man.
Okay.
Detectives explained that without cooperation, the killer would likely go free.
Okay. Yep, very good.
Although he knew he was jeopardizing his own safety, he promised to meet with detectives and help them in any way he could. The following day, Satyendra Singh came to the police station as promised.
Yes, sir.
He brought with him another witness, Sarvjit, who was also willing to talk. They told detectives they believed a wealthy and powerful Indian man named Dhinsa had ordered the murder of their friend, as well as the abduction of their friend's brother. Dhinsa was a corrupt and ruthless businessman who was well known in the Sikh community. Like many others, he had come to the U.S. from India in the mid-1980s with only a few dollars in his pocket. But his story was different than most. He had amassed an empire of more than 50 gas stations in and around New York City.
And which was common with all the...
The witnesses knew several of Dhinsa's employees and explained to Detective Teddy Braun that the millionaire would stop at nothing to protect his business.
His whole thing was fear. He used the fear tactic that he had this community petrified of him. I mean, to the point where he could walk in and do something in front of hundreds of people and no one's gonna say nothing.
Police also learned that Dhinsa was no stranger to crime. His record included convictions for felony assault, kidnapping, robbery, gas pump fraud, and weapons possession. He'd served time, but always managed to get back on the street to run his mafia-style operation. Within the Sikh community, Dhinsa was known as the Indian Godfather. The witnesses said Dhinsa's empire was a family affair, with Dhinsa's brother a member of the inner circle and an enforcer for the organization. Sarvjit had seen for himself just how ruthless the brother could be. In 1993, outside a Queens restaurant, the informant witnessed Dhinsa's brother arguing with a man. The disagreement ended with Dhinsa's brother shooting him at close range. Sarvjit rushed to the victim's side, but it was too late. Dhinsa's brother was spirited out of the country to India. He was never captured. The witnesses now told the detectives that they'd heard the brother would soon be returning to America. They were risking their lives talking to police, but they couldn't let the violence continue.
Yes, sir.
Both promised to report when Dhinsa's brother arrived.
He's going to be coming back to the United States because Dhinsa's company was getting so big that Dhinsa needed another hand. And Dhinsa was the type of person where he'd rather have family hands-on than outsiders when it came to his money.
True to their word, in May of 1997, the witnesses told police that Dhinsa's brother was back in New York. Police set up outside the warehouse of Dhinsa's headquarters in Brooklyn, waiting for his brother to arrive.
In front is clear.
Both witnesses were present to assist police with identifying the murder suspect.
We have a possible target. Stand by.
Armed with an arrest warrant, police surrounded the building and cordoned off all entrances, including the back doors of the warehouse. From the surveillance van, Satinderjit confirmed that it was Dhinsa's brother heading for the front door.
We have a target entering the building.
Moments later, officers reported that shots were fired inside the building. They held their posts, waiting for orders.
Ready? We're going in. Let's go.
Officers forcibly entered the front of the building. 3 men raced out the back door into the hands of police. The men were Dhinsa's brother, his cousin, and his nephew. All 3 were arrested. Quickly securing a search warrant, police confiscated firearms, 7 pistols, a shotgun, and a silenced machine gun. As they loaded the contraband into a police car, Dhinsa himself arrived at the scene. He protested the seizure, claiming that the building and guns were his property. But the guns were illegal. Police arrested him on weapons possession charges. They took him to the 112th precinct, where Dhinsa was booked and fingerprinted. Police pressured him to cooperate. They had 2 witnesses who would testify against him and his brother for murder. Insisting he was innocent, he refused to talk. Dhinsa was held in the Brooklyn Correctional Facility awaiting a bail hearing. But incarceration did not prevent the murder suspect from running his empire. Speaking in Punjabi so guards couldn't understand him, he coerced employees and acquaintances to find out who dared to testify against him and his brother. Besides witness statements, police had little other evidence. Dhinsa would be out on bail shortly. If he discovered the identity of the witnesses, they might not testify. Then, the murder and weapons charges against the brothers would have to be dropped. In May 1997, New York City police arrested 2 East Indian brothers who had been terrorizing their immigrant community for years. Except for the statements of 2 witnesses, investigators had little evidence against them. But they believed that Dhinsa was the ringleader and that he had ordered 2 murders and a kidnapping. Dhinsa had posted bail on May 4th, 1997, just days after his arrest. But his brother remained held on a murder charge in New York City's Rikers Island prison. Through informants, Dhinsa had learned the identity of the 2 witnesses against him. If they continued to cooperate with the police, he, his brother, and his multi-million-dollar gas station empire would be in jeopardy. One of the witnesses, Satyendra Singh, was close with several employees of the suspected murderer. He knew a great deal about how Dhinsa ran his $60 million gas station chain. He said that Dhinsa rigged pumps, skimmed profits, and ordered people abducted if they talked.
How much did you know about Dhinsa, what you told?
Detectives believed the information was compelling enough to seek an indictment. In early June of 1997, investigators met with the assistant U.S. attorney to explore Dhinsa's illegal activities. NYPD detective Teddy Braun explained how Dhinsa's pump rigging scheme worked.
Dhinsa owned like 53 gas stations, and he had this unique skimming system. And what it did was, it regulated the amount of gas that was pumped into a consumer's vehicle. So if you would have went in and asked for $10 worth of gas, he'd be able to set up that machine where it can give you 80%, 90%, whatever percent that he wanted to give you, and the rest would be saved.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell learned that not only was Dhinsa's empire corrupt, it was extensive.
The NYPD informed us that Dhinsa had, among other things, an organization built around pump fraud, basically ripping off customers at his gasoline stations throughout the New York and New Jersey area, by which he generated millions of dollars in income. That he protected that pump fraud activity through a pattern of violent crime, including murder.
On June 18th, just as the federal investigation was beginning, witness Satyendra Singh was shot to death in Queens. It was the day before Dhinsa's brother, suspected of murder, was scheduled to attend a hearing. At the crime scene, a neighbor told police he had witnessed the crime. He had been outside at the top of his stoop when the shooting took place. Since his apartment lacked air conditioning, he was watching a Mets game on his front porch. He was distracted by what appeared to be a traffic dispute. The neighbor described the shooter as a tall African-American male, but he never saw his face. The slain man's cousin was sitting beside his relative in the car when he was killed. The cousin told police it had all happened so fast. He was too shaken to remember any details. Forensic technicians photographed the scene. They collected shells that had been fired from a 9mm handgun. No other physical evidence was found. Nothing to prove that Dhinsa was responsible. Investigators believed that Dhinsa would continue to use any means necessary to protect his millions. They needed some way to stop him. NYPD detectives turned to Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell for guidance. He would refocus the investigation to take advantage of the federal RICO statute, the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, a law used to prosecute organized crime.
This looked like, had all the hallmarks of a racketeering prosecution. It had an organization with leadership, it had racketeering activity which generated income, and it had a pattern of criminal activity which spanned several years, almost a decade.
This would widen the scope of the investigation considerably. The Assistant U.S. Attorney called on the FBI for help. Special Agent in Charge Kevin Donovan from the FBI's New York field office worked the case.
The FBI was planning on conducting a traditional organized crime investigation that would focus on development of cooperating witnesses, use of cooperating witnesses, review of records, and search warrants to focus on the multiple acts of violence and the multiple acts of fraud.
That would not be easy. In order to develop new witnesses, agents would have to ensure the safety of those who came forward.
As long as Dhinsa Singh was able to intimidate witnesses through violence, threats of violence, and homicides, our investigation would be very limited. We needed to make sure that no other individuals who would cooperate with us would be hurt by Dhinsa Singh.
News of the most recent killing spread quickly through the Sikh community. The other witness, Sarvjit, and his family prepared to leave town. Investigators pleaded with him to allow the FBI to place him under protective custody. But he insisted on taking his wife and 2 small children away from New York. Despite investigators' best efforts, Dhinsa had intimidated another witness. To the Sikh community, the police and the FBI seemed powerless to protect them. In the summer of 1997, the FBI was on the trail of a violent businessman named Dhinsa. Investigators believed he had already killed 2 men, kidnapped a third, and scared another out of New York. They needed an informant close to Dhinsa to get enough evidence to arrest him.
I will get back to you.
But Special Agent in Charge Kevin Donovan found that Dhinsa was well protected.
The major hurdle that the FBI and the New York City Police Department had to overcome was an inability to develop cooperating witnesses and informants early on due to language difficulties and due to the fact that most of the individuals who worked at City Gas Corporation were not willing to come forward because of Dhinsa Singh's threats of violence and his acts of violence that were well known throughout the community.
Dhinsa now threatened the life of another member of the Sikh community. Balwant Singh was close friends with the witness who had fled the city with his family. The man was terrified. Dhinsa had come after him to find the one remaining witness. He remained holed up in his apartment with his wife and daughter for 3 days before he finally called police. He reached the Queens Homicide Unit, which was investigating the murder of Satyendra Singh, a witness against Dhinsa. Balwan told police that he had attended the slain man's funeral. There he was approached by one of Dhinsa's men. He asked Balwan where the other witness was hiding. Dhinsa wanted to discuss the witness's testimony face to face. Balwan refused to tell him anything. But now he feared for his own life. Police told him that they would discuss the possibility of providing him and his family with protective custody. 2 detectives would be right over. Since the funeral, he had been ignoring the demands of the construction company he owned.
Mr. Singh, please.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Singh. Needed down here at the office.
When the company called, he agreed to run an urgent errand. He left his frightened family, promising he'd return as soon as he could. He knew Dhinsa's reputation. It would be difficult to avoid him for very long. Just minutes after pulling out, the man noticed a sedan that seemed to be following him. It was Dhinsa. Balwan didn't want to take any chances, so he returned home. Dhinsa sped away. As detectives headed for Balwan's apartment, they received a page. It was a coded message from their supervisor, asking them to call in immediately. Lacking a cell phone, they stopped to make the urgent call. While the detective was on the phone, he noticed an Indian man watching him closely from a car. He decided to investigate. The detectives asked the driver for his license and registration. It was Dhinsa.
Mind stepping that, sir?
When detectives asked to search his car, he agreed. Inside, they found some gas receipts. In the trunk, detectives also found electronic gauges for gas pumps. Dhinsa possessed nothing that was illegal. Since there was no outstanding warrant for his arrest, detectives let him go. The detectives were called away on an emergency. They never made it to the informant's home that day. The next morning, the man's frightened wife called police. Her husband had taken refuge in a friend's gas station. He waited anxiously for them to arrive and was relieved to see them pull up. His wife and daughter were picked up moments later. That evening, the family was taken to an undisclosed hotel outside of New York. The family would hide there under police protection until Dhinsa could be arrested. Detectives informed Balwant that they had run into Dhinsa near his neighborhood. They asked if he could verify the man's identity from a photo. Balwant identified him instantly. Investigators had one more witness in their case against the deadly businessman, but they still lacked sufficient evidence to make an arrest. In July of 1997, FBI agents and NYPD detectives believed gas station mogul Dhinsa was the man behind the murders of 2 Indian immigrants and the disappearance of a third. Investigators had little evidence to prove their theory, and Dhinsa's intimidation had silenced most witnesses. But a few among the community were tired of living in fear. At the end of July, Brooklyn North homicide detective Teddy Braun interviewed a source close to Dhinsa.
During the interview with the confidential informant, my partner Tony Pizzata came across a name Marvin, who was linked as Dhinsa Singh's strong arm.
The man's full name was Marvin Dodson. He was a 35-year-old African-American male. Detectives discovered that he had an arrest record for illegal firearms.
Any of these men look familiar?
They showed a photo lineup to the cousin of the slain witness who was in the car when the shooting occurred.
You recognize any of these men?
He immediately identified Dodson as the gunman. Detective Anthony Brizada now began searching for Marvin Dodson.
My partner and myself put together a list of various locations, like about 6 or 8 locations where he hung out, his residence, his relatives.
On July 4th, 1997, police cornered Dodson in a Queens neighborhood.
Marvin Dodson! Turn off your ignition! Throw your keys out the window now! Do it! Come out of the car, sir!
They arrested him and took him to the station.
Go to the door, do it! Stop!
Dodson agreed to testify against Dhinsa in return for a lighter sentence. On Sunday morning, July 6, 1997, Dodson and his attorney met with Queens homicide detectives, the assistant U.S. attorney, and the FBI. Dodson confessed that he had been hired by Dhinsa for the murder. Dodson said the plan to kill one of the witnesses began on May 18, 1997. At the time, Dhinsa had just been released on bail. Dodson would be the trigger man, hired to kill the witness scheduled to testify against Dhinsa and his brother. First, they picked up the murder weapon, a 9mm Ruger. The same caliber of shell casings were later collected at the crime scene. Dodson told investigators that Dhinsa then ordered him to hire a driver for the hit.
Go ahead and tell us a story.
Dhinsa's next move was to conduct surveillance of the witnesses. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell recalls that Dhinsa provided Dodson with all the information he'd needed to get to Satyendra Singh.
He gave Mr. Dodson the address where Satyendra Singh lived, the license plate number to his vehicle, and instructed Mr. Dodson to watch Satyendra Singh and kill him at the first opportunity.
What do you do with the gun?
On June 18th, 1997, Dodson received a phone call from Dhinsa. His boss told him that the witness needed to be dead before nightfall. Dhinsa's brother's hearing was the following day. The hit would send a message to everyone who considered testifying. Dodson said that he and his driver, Walter Jazz Samuels, met Dhinsa at one of his gas stations. Dhinsa provided them with a white van. They watched Satyendrat's house until he came out. He was with his cousin. The plan was to cause a disturbance so that Satyendrat would pull over and allow the van to pass. When he did, the van blocked him from moving. Dodson shot the unarmed man 8 times at close range. The hitman's description of the events of that day corroborated a neighbor's statement to police. Dodson also told investigators that after the killing, he had returned the white van to Dhinsa's garage on Roosevelt Avenue. He gave the gun back to Dhinsa, who paid him and the driver $20,000 for the hit. On July 6, 1997, police approached the Brooklyn home of Walter Jazz Samuels, the man who Dodson claimed had driven the van.
Samuels.
They arrested him without incident.
New York City Police Department. Keep your head straight ahead.
Police learned that Samuels had a record of previous arrests. With Samuels in custody, investigators turned their attention to Dhinsa. The U.S. Attorney's Office believed agents and detectives now had enough evidence to indict Dhinsa on federal racketeering charges. Special Agent in Charge Kevin Donovan recalls that agents dispersed across the city to find him.
FBI agents and New York City Police Department detectives initiated surveillances at several City Gas Corporation gas stations in which Dhinsa Singh was known to frequent.
At 5 p.m. on July 7, 1997, FBI agents and NYPD detectives followed Dhinsa to his Foster Avenue gas station. When he arrived, they arrested him for murder, kidnapping, pump fraud, and obstruction of justice in aid of a corrupt organization. The entire case hinged on the testimony of Dhinsa's hitman, Marvin Dodson. But because Dodson was a murderer, the U.S. attorney still needed to substantiate his story with other evidence or witness testimony. They hoped that testimony would come from Walter Jazz Samuels, the man who Dodson fingered as his accomplice in the murder of Satyendrat Singh. Samuels now told investigators he was not in the van at the time of the shooting. He claimed he was at a nearby restaurant. His story checked out. Investigators believed Samuels knew who drove Dodson on the day of the killing. But he wasn't talking, and neither was Dodson. Investigators needed something else to corroborate Dodson's story. They secured a search warrant for Dhinsa's Roosevelt Avenue gas station, the place where Dodson had returned the white van after the murder. They searched the entire premises, but found little other than stolen license plates. They believed they were probably used on getaway cars during the commission of crimes. But once again, they had no proof. They found nothing that could corroborate Dodson's story or connect Dhinsa to the murder. As the FBI and police continued to pursue evidence, Dhinsa was behind bars once again, pending a July 14th bail hearing. Investigators hoped Dhinsa's incarceration would encourage witnesses to come forward. It did not. As before, Dhinsa continued to rule with an iron hand.
Unfortunately, as a result of Dhinsa Singh's ability to make telephone calls from jail, he was able to continue to run his corporation and his business and to focus on threatening additional individuals who might have come forward to cooperate with the FBI and the New York City Police Department.
For the second time in 3 months, authorities held the suspected murderer behind bars. They hoped it would be his final arrest. But the millionaire hired a high-priced defense team, and the prosecution's entire case still hinged on the testimony of a confessed killer. In July of 1997, a man named Dhinsa had been arrested on federal racketeering charges that included murder and kidnapping to protect his corrupt business empire. It was his second arrest in 3 months. As he had before, Dhinsa directed his business and even threatened potential witnesses from a prison telephone. But this time, investigators were listening. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell was not going to let Dhinsa slip through his hands again. They had to keep him behind bars.
First, his conversation was in Punjabi, which is a very unique dialect, and it took us some time before we could find a Punjabi translator to translate those telephone calls. Secondly, he was not very overt in his conversation, so he's somewhat cryptic in his conversation with his colleagues.
The translations opened a rare view into just how tightly Dhinsa held the reins to his empire. Dhinsa attracted customers to his rigged pumps by advertising the lowest gas prices in New York. But his pumps provided less than a gallon for the price.
He was issuing routine instructions to the members of his office, telling them to change the price of gasoline at his various stations, to continue to order supplies for his company. In addition, he also gave them instructions about things to communicate to their attorneys and steps to be taken in order to try and get him out on bail.
As Campbell raced to find evidence to keep Dhinsa from making bail, police processed the suspect's car. They found business cards that linked Dhinsa to his hitman, Marvin Dodson, and Dodson's operative, Walter Jazz Samuels. Police also recovered a list of names and addresses that appeared to be a hit list. The list included the home address of Sarvjit Singh, a federal witness who had fled the city with his family. Balwant Singh, who was under protective custody, had also made the list. 7 more men with Punjabi names appeared as well. It was just what investigators needed to keep Dhinsa from making bail. While they did not know whether these men were dead or alive, they knew who might. Agents asked Walter Samuels about the list, hoping it would prompt his memory. He finally opened up. He said that Dhinsa had planned to kill those 9 men. 2 of them, Balwant and Sarvjit, were federal witnesses. The other 7 were Balwant's family members. They were all still alive. Once again, agents would need to corroborate the story. Confined in the room next door, Marvin Dodson and his lawyer waited to be questioned.
Tell me what it means to you.
Dodson confirmed Samuel's story and added something else. He said that on July 3rd, just days before Dhinsa's most recent arrest, Dhinsa had purchased 2 used police cruisers as part of the assassination plan. Dodson had copies of the titles, which his lawyer now offered to the agent as proof.
Mr. Dhinsa's plan was for Mr. Dodson and Mr. Samuels to pose as law enforcement officers and to stop Balwant Singh on the street along with members of his family and kidnap them and bring them to Mr. Dhinsa at an undisclosed location.
You're going to try to cram all these people.
Feeling the pressure and hoping to cut a deal, Samuels now told investigators the name of the man who drove the white van during the murder. His name was Evans Alonzo Powell. Because Powell had no arrest record, Dodson wanted to protect him. He had threatened Samuels not to give him up. On July 19, 1997, police arrested Powell on a Brooklyn street. He agreed to cooperate. Powell admitted that he had driven the van for the murder in Queens. Investigators finally had their corroborating witness. Powell also talked about another crime.
Tell us more about where...
Dhinsa had ordered the murder of the Indian man who had traveled to America to search for his missing brother. Powell was present when Dodson killed the attendant at the Brooklyn gas station on the night of March 16, 1997. Detective Tony Brizada remembers Dodson's confession.
He admitted shooting him twice in the head, had him kneeling down. And he said he got paid by Singh for doing this. That Singh wanted this person killed. He didn't give him a reason, but he just wanted him killed.
Dhinsa had paid Dodson just $4,000 for taking the man's life. Dodson stole money to pay Powell for being the lookout. Special agent in charge Kevin Donovan continued to gather evidence about Dhinsa's pump rigging activities.
The FBI and the New York City Police Department executed a search warrant at the Foster Avenue City Gas station. The focus of our search was to identify and obtain evidence of the pump rigging scheme. As a result of the excavation of the area around the pump, electronic devices were located in a box that was used to control the pump rigging scheme.
Investigators determined that Dhinsa manipulated the flow of gasoline to customers' cars through devices controlled by remote. Wired to the pumps and buried underground, the systems could be turned on or off at will. Detective Teddy Braun explains that Dhinsa taught many of his employees when to turn them on and off.
You were taught how to work on remote. And what would happen would be if a person, like for instance, if a person came in for a gallon of gas for their lawnmower, what would happen was the gas attendant would hit a remote in his pocket, which was just like a car alarm remote. And what that would do, it would shut off the skimming system. And the system would go right up to perfect. So that when the gas attendant pumped a gallon worth of gas in a container, it was perfect. So there would be no question.
In late July of 1997, the FBI conducted an exhaustive search of Dhinsa's Brooklyn warehouse headquarters. There they found his double books.
We discovered documents reflecting bribery payments to a corrupt Department of Consumer Affairs inspector. In addition, we also estimate the total value of Mr. Dhinsa's pump fraud activities in the neighborhood of $40 million over 10 years.
By September of 1998, the body of the man abducted from a gas station in the Bronx in 1995 was still missing. But agents had a hunch. Based on New York City construction records at the time of his disappearance, agents suspected that Dhinsa had buried the attendant underneath one of his gas stations.
It was determined that the most likely gas station that was under construction at that time was a gas station located at Farragut and Flatbush Avenue.
On September 16, 1998, investigators arrived at the station with heavy equipment. They employed ground-penetrating radar to help locate the body beneath the earth. They selected two separate sites where they believed the man might be buried.
The construction crew removed slabs of concrete, and the FBI, the New York City Police Department, examined these two sites that were located by the ground-penetrating radar.
Investigators never found the man's body. Though this news was disappointing, investigators were having better luck with other leads. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell subpoenaed Dhinsa's cell phone records. They placed Dhinsa at the time and place of Satyendra Singh's murder. Prosecutors were well armed when Dhinsa's trial began in Brooklyn Federal District Court.
Court
They hoped to convict him on 29 counts, including capital murder. Savjit Singh, who assisted the investigation despite death threats, testified against the man accused of killing his friends. On March 2nd, 1999, after 2.5 days of deliberations, the jury found Dhinsa guilty of 21 of the 29 counts. They included murder, attempted murder, and fraud. Dhinsa was acquitted in the kidnapping of the man whose body was never found. On October 5th, 1999, Dhinsa received 8 life sentences without possibility of parole. He escaped the death penalty. Later that month, the same judge sentenced Dhinsa's hitmen for their roles in the murders. For assisting in the conviction of Dhinsa, their sentences were considerably lighter. Powell received 10 years, Samuels 12, and Dodson 18. But it was the conviction of Dhinsa that was most satisfying to prosecutors.
Prosecution of Mr. Dhinsa was a very, sort of personally for me, a very rewarding experience. We were able to step into a community that frequently does not turn to law enforcement for assistance, and to render some significant help to them in order to remove an individual who was, for lack of a better term, a plague on that community.
Like many immigrants before him, Dhinsa arrived a poor man and was embraced by a community of compatriots. But he repaid their kindness with swindles and murder. For his greed and brutality, he will never be free again. In New York in the 1980s, the emergence of crack cocaine brought a new wave of violence. Drug dealers robbed and killed as they scrambled for power. Ordinary citizens were victimized. Even children were not immune. The FBI joined forces with the New York City police to take back the streets. Their best weapon against deadly drug gangs was the C-11 squad.
New York City is no stranger to gang violence. But when a 12-year-old child was kidnapped, the gangs had crossed the line. Law enforcement raced to find the missing boy before it was too late. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents would have to infiltrate the secretive world of a vicious gang to stop the murderous exploits of a drug lord.
In the 1980s, crack cocaine invaded the Harlem section of New York, as it did many urban areas in America. Over time, the cheap and highly addictive drug crippled communities unlike any other drug had before. With the crack came ruthlessly violent gangs that ruled the streets. No one was truly safe. On December 5th, 1989, 12-year-old Donnell Porter was walking to elementary school alone. He never made it to class that day. When he didn't arrive home after school, his family worried. They hadn't been able to find him in the neighborhood. At 9 p.m., Donnell's sister received a phone call.
Yeah.
A man on the other end said Donnell had been kidnapped. He wanted $500,000 or the boy would be killed.
Inside the men's bathroom.
The sister said the family didn't have that kind of money. It didn't matter to the caller.
Yeah.
He warned them not to contact police, then instructed them to go to a restaurant at 125th and Broadway. Behind a trash can in the restroom, they'd find something that would prove he was serious.
You got it?
A family friend went to the restaurant so the porters could stay by the phone. He didn't know if it was a setup. Following the kidnapper's orders, he checked behind the trash container and found a coffee can. Inside were 2 rings, an audio cassette, and a child's severed finger. Donnell was hurt and could be bleeding to death. Despite being warned not to, the family called the New York City police.
Following you, looking at you. Nobody standing around.
The family told investigators what they knew. Detectives inspected the evidence. The sister said that the rings belonged to Donnell. They'd been given to the boy by his older brother. On the tape, a recorded plea for help was definitely Donnell's voice. The family told detectives about a second call in which the kidnapper had lowered his ransom to $350,000. It was still far beyond their means. They said they didn't know why they were targeted for such a high ransom. But detectives knew what the family wouldn't say. The victim's older brother, Richard Porter, was a major crack cocaine dealer in the area. Police believe the kidnapping was related to his drug empire. NYPD contacted the New York FBI's reactive squad for assistance. Special Agent David Higgins, a narcotics expert, was asked to provide more intelligence on Richard Porter.
Anything they have, any of them. Richard Porter, then about 25 years of age, was a well-known crack dealer whose activities took place in central Harlem. He was one of those individuals who got in early on the crack trade in New York, and he had created a significant drug empire in central Harlem.
Richard Porter had made millions of dollars selling crack on New York's streets. Detectives knew where his turf was.
What's going on, man?
It didn't take long to find Porter. Detectives recognized the person he was with as his drug-running partner, Alpo Martinez. This visit wasn't about drugs. It was about finding Donnell. Porter agreed to come to the station for an interview, though he said he didn't know how he could help.
Look, guys, I don't know anything.
Police knew Porter was very close to Donnell, but he claimed to know nothing about who was behind his brother's kidnapping. On the streets, these matters are usually solved without the cops. Though Porter most likely held the key to finding Donnell, he was in no position to talk to authorities.
Richard Porter, because of his situation as a drug trafficker, found himself in a ticklish situation legally. It would have been difficult for him to cooperate directly with law enforcement. I believe he attempted to handle this situation on his own to some extent.
Police had nothing to hold him on. Authorities needed to find someone else to help them. They canvassed the area, trying to gather information on the kidnapping. In such a close-knit neighborhood, someone had to have heard something about Donnell. But residents were too afraid to talk. Harlem's violent gangs had a stranglehold on the community. Detectives were left with nothing. With each passing day, police in NYPD's 32nd precinct knew Donnell's chance of survival decreased. Investigators maintained contact with the boy's family, who were desperate for more word from the kidnappers.
We need to get to the bottom of this.
A week after the abduction, the family received a note. In it, the kidnappers hinted Donnell was still alive. They demanded their money. But no more ransom calls came. With no clues to the boy's whereabouts and no one talking, police had reached a dead end. They somehow needed to pressure Richard Porter into cooperating, or hope he would pay the ransom to get Donnell back. Then, on January 4th, 1990, a month after Donnell's abduction, the body of his brother, drug kingpin Richard Porter, was found in a Bronx park. He had been shot twice, in the head and chest. There would be no one to pay the ransom now.
It was widely assumed that Richard's death was connected to the kidnapping and probably the result of a ransom payment gone bad. However, it was noted early on that when his body was discovered, his wallet contained over $2,000 in U.S. currency. His jewelry was there. Apparently, his automobile was nearby. So there was some question about what the actual motivations were behind his murder.
With Richard Porter's death, investigators lost their closest connection to the abducted 12-year-old. To find another source, they increased pressure on lower-level dealers in Porter's organization. Facing drug charges, they were offered leniency in exchange for information. Some said Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, could be involved. Others claimed an infamous Harlem gang called the Preacher Crew might be. But none offered direct leads to the crime. 3 weeks later, a boy's body was recovered in the same Bronx park where Richard Porter was found. His family identified the body of Donnell Porter. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head.
The death of a child is always a disturbing event. There's a 12-year-old boy, he's on the way to public school. He's kidnapped, tortured. He's heard on the tape cassette crying for help from his family.
Donnell's murder stunned the entire Harlem community, even though violence was a daily occurrence there. At the time, Sergeant James Marr worked NYPD's notorious 32nd Precinct, where Donnell lived.
In the late 80s and the early 90s, 32nd Precinct, which is actually geographically only 1 square mile, was one of the most violent precincts in New York City. They averaged in the area of the upper 60s to low 70s of homicides a year, and added on to that were shootings, several hundred shootings, that the people didn't die.
In response to the increased violence in the city, a task force called the C-11 Squad had been formed at the FBI's New York field office. Detectives from the 32nd Precinct and FBI agents were assigned to the squad.
C-11 was created to address these entrenched criminal conspiracy groups in the city of New York. The locals brought their knowledge of the streets, the knowledge of the subjects involved to the table. The federal agents brought along with them the access to the federal courts, which included the access to the federal sentencing guidelines in the United States Attorney's Office.
After the murder of Donnell Porter, they knew they had to take back the streets. C-11 would first go after Alpo Martinez, Richard Porter's partner.
The problem is here, we haven't
If their
identified the
partnership
other
had unraveled, he would have had the most to gain from extorting Richard Porter and killing him.
We're still working on some surveillance.
A year earlier, a warrant had been sworn out for his arrest on drug charges. But when Martinez couldn't be found, federal prosecutors had to drop the warrant. In police computers, the C-11 squad flagged the names of known associates of Alpo Martinez. If any were arrested, they would be notified. Months later, police in Washington, D.C. pulled over a car after observing its driver engage in a drug deal. The driver was a known courier for Alpo Martinez. Police found a large amount of crack and thousands of dollars in his car. Noting the flag on his record from New York, D.C. authorities would contact the C-11 squad. After the courier was sentenced to 20 years to life on drug charges, C-11 agents had him transported to New York for an interview.
I want some information about him because we want...
An agent explained that under federal law, his sentence could be reviewed if he cooperated with authorities.
You're just making this difficult on yourself. Where does he... All I know...
He told what he knew about Martinez and Porter's East Coast drug operation.
Drugs would be distributed both in New York City by Richard Porter and in Washington, D.C. by Alpo Martinez. While in Washington, D.C., Martinez allied himself with individuals that he found to be strong on the street, if you will, in order to protect his drug operation in Washington, D.C. And it was not unusual for literally sea bags worth of U.S. currency to be shipped out of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. up into the Porter neighborhood at 132nd and 7th Avenue in New York City.
It was enough for a renewed arrest warrant on Alpo Martinez. Agents canvassed the neighborhood, talking to people who knew Martinez. Most were afraid to talk. Eventually, agents learned the fugitive was going to pick up his wife's car at a dealership in northern New Jersey. Undercover agents staked out the dealership. They didn't know if Martinez would show up, but they knew he liked fast cars. That afternoon, a sports car pulled up. They watched a passenger get out, but it wasn't Martinez.
There he goes. He's going over to the building. I'm coming over.
Agents couldn't tell if the fugitive was driving.
Can you see him?
They had to risk a closer look. If they could arrest Martinez, it might help solve the murders of Richard Porter and his 12-year-old brother, Donnell. An agent visually identified Martinez as the driver. He radioed a go-ahead signal. But before the arrest team could respond, Martinez spun away. Agents gave chase, but the fugitive disappeared into heavy traffic. With Alpo Martinez still a fugitive, the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter remained unsolved. The abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter showed that Harlem's drug violence was out of control. The FBI's C-11 squad knew the murder was connected to the boy's brother, crack dealer Richard Porter. But Porter himself had been killed. C-11 believed finding Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, would provide answers. But in 1991, Martinez had eluded an FBI undercover operation. From the incident, the FBI got his license plate number and alerted New York police to be on the lookout for the vehicle. The next day, police spotted it, parked on a Harlem street. They impounded it, hoping it might lead to Martinez. They believed the fugitive wouldn't retrieve the vehicle himself, but FBI Special Agent David Higgins waited to see if he'd send someone.
A young lady showed up who claimed to be the true owner. She was the registered owner. Ultimately, a quick investigation established that she was what we call a straw man, or somebody who had stepped forward in order to buy and register the car on behalf of Mr. Martinez.
Martinez was nowhere to be found in New York. Acting on a tip that he had traveled to Washington, D.C., agents set up surveillance at the D.C. home of the fugitive's ex-wife. In the early hours of November 7th, 1991, they spotted Martinez getting into his ex-wife's vehicle. This time, he wasn't driving. As they pulled out, the FBI made their move. The fugitive's ex-wife pulled over. The cocaine in his possession helped cement the case against one of the biggest drug traffickers on the East Coast.
Ultimately, Mr. Martinez pled guilty to an indictment in the Eastern District of Virginia, which accused him of trafficking in over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine. The wholesale value of that would be $20 million.
Investigators also had evidence against Martinez on several gangland murders. They told him they knew he was Richard Porter's partner, so he stood to gain from Donnell's and Richard's death. Hoping to avoid the death penalty, Alpo Martinez agreed to cooperate. He admitted killing his partner, Richard Porter. Martinez had begun to suspect his partner had been cheating him out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. He said that more than a year earlier, on January 4th, 1990, he and an associate had taken Richard Porter for a ride. Almost immediately, Martinez and the associate each shot him. They dumped his body in the Bronx Park, where it was found the next day. Martinez swore it was just about missing drug money. It had nothing to do with Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. No evidence or testimony linked Martinez to that crime. He went to prison for life. Although they had put away a major drug dealer, the local and federal investigators of the C-11 squad were no closer to solving the murder of Donnell Porter. They reviewed FBI intelligence already gathered on other Harlem gangsters who might have profited from extorting and killing Richard Porter. One gang stood out as likely suspects. They were known as the Preacher Crew. The gang's leader was Clarence Preacher Heatley. FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh, formerly of the C-11 squad, knew the Preacher and his crew were well entrenched and very dangerous.
Preacher Crew was the established crew in the neighborhood, for a long time. Preacher had been kicking around the streets of Harlem since the early 70s, and everybody knew him by his nickname, the Black Hand of Death, and everybody was deathly afraid of him.
NYPD Sergeant James Marr of the C-11 squad learned the Preacher had a reputation for violence. But the gangster was an elusive figure in Harlem.
You could walk up to anybody in the 32nd precinct, no matter how church-going they are, no matter whether they're businessmen or local drug dealers, They all have a Preacher story. They all know who Preacher is. Ask any of them to describe Preacher to you, or a majority of them, they're not going to be able to. Because this guy was an infamous legend in Harlem.
The players in Harlem's drug underworld had carved up the area into zones. Each block, each alley was the established turf of a single dealer. Most dealers respected the boundaries. But the Preacher did not. He considered all of Harlem his turf. He made his money not by dealing drugs, but by taxing other dealers.
But he was mostly into extortion, extorting drug dealers. These are guys that were violent in their own right. He would go up and claim their car. If a drug dealer looked like he was getting paid, so to say, he was driving a brand new full-size Mercedes-Benz, and Preacher liked that car, that was Preacher's.
Those who argued with Preacher paid a heavy price. It was a system that made him a rich man.
If you're hitting every other drug dealer on the streets, you know, 2,000 here, 3,000 here, 5,000 there, that's a lot of money. It adds up. And believe me, they all paid, because if they didn't pay, Preacher would pay him a visit, or he would order his people to pay him a visit, and they'd wind up dead.
The Preacher's history of extortion and violence made him a likely suspect in the abduction and murder of Donnell Porter. C-11 had outlined the basic structure of the Preacher crew.
Including some of his other main guys in his crew.
The Preacher's main lieutenant was a man named John Cuff. He was a particularly dangerous criminal, according to C-11's detective Vinnie Flynn.
John Cuff was an ex-New York City housing cop. As a cop, he provided protection and bodyguard work for Preacher. So if they were driving through the neighborhood and were stopped, John Cuff had a shield where he would probably be let go and not given a summons or anything further would happen. John Cuff had a reputation of one to be feared, very violent person.
Yet no evidence linked either man to Donnell Porter. Though C-11 suspected Preacher was involved in the deadly kidnapping, he probably didn't commit it himself. He distanced himself from most of the crimes, having his main lieutenant and other henchmen carry out his orders.
I know you got so much. I know you got so much, man.
At Preacher's command, their brutal extortion tactics earned them money and kept witnesses too intimidated to talk, effectively insulating the crew against investigation.
We go into a bodega or someplace up in Harlem, and we'd say, we know he came in here, and the guy would have a cast on his hand. We know he broke your hand, and the shop owner would say, I don't know what you're talking about, and that shop owner would be paying rent, or tax to Preacher, but nobody would tell us anything.
With people too afraid to talk, crimes continued to pile up. On New Year's Eve, 1992, emergency units responded to a call in the Preacher's territory. A man lay dead in his car, the victim of a drive-by shooting. His family survived the harrowing ordeal. They described how the killers pulled up next to them on the street and opened fire. They claimed they didn't know who did it or why. And like Donnell's kidnapping, no one in the neighborhood admitted seeing anything. It was another tragic killing in Harlem that might go unsolved. The C-11 squad had to breach the area's violently enforced code of silence and finally get insiders to talk. A shocking drive-by shooting was added to the list of unsolved murders in Harlem. With witnesses too afraid to cooperate with police, the case was open for 2 years. Then in 1994, the C-11 squad found a witness who told them the shooter was a preacher crew member named Malik. Detective Vinnie Flynn learned that Malik had a violent reputation.
He became a so-called director of security for the preacher organization. He was in charge of the group of members who were known as the janitors. The janitors were the people that had to clean up the problems or the mess of the family. And you couldn't be a janitor unless you killed somebody.
To get more on Malik and the preacher crew, C-11 tried to send in undercover officers. It was yet another dead end, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
We weren't able to really get in, so to speak, and get an undercover in there to buy narcotics from Preacher, because Preacher was very, very careful. He was, he's a very smart man, and we couldn't get the undercover, close to him.
The preacher had closed ranks, ordering the people he extorted not to sell to new buyers and to keep a low profile on the street. Investigators needed a witness with close ties to the crew. They distributed business cards, hoping one would find its way to an insider willing to talk. Their persistence paid off. In April 1994, a crew member contacted the C-11 squad because he realized his life was in danger. He said the preacher had started going after his own crew members. Preacher had killed 2 of the informant's partners. Fearing he was next, he asked Sergeant James Marr for protection.
It was a stone-cold killer himself who became an informant that was so fearful of Preacher and of being killed like his partners had that he came to me, that he came to us, that he gave us information on specific crimes, that he talked about crimes that had been unsolved for years.
Investigators were frustrated that the informant knew nothing of 12-year-old Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. But he did give investigators their first specific insider information about Preacher Heatley's organization. He mentioned a killing basement that the crew used as a meeting place and execution chamber. At some meetings, Preacher would call for a vote on the fate of gang members who had fallen out of favor. If the majority voted thumbs down, Preacher ordered a murder. In March 1994, Preacher called for a vote on Malik, the janitor who had done the drive-by shooting. He believed Malik could no longer be trusted. The vote was thumbs down.
Yeah, what's up?
Preacher summoned Malik to headquarters.
How y'all doing? All right, most love, man. Most love, man. Most love. How you doing? I ain't seen you in a long time. Where you been at, man? Most love. That was, man. How it is?
Malik thought he was there to take part in the beating of a crew member that he had had problems with in the past.
Jay, I know you're slinging, man. All right, word.
Not realizing he was the real target, Malik was excited when others invited him to the basement.
If you went down there and you were followed in there, somebody was behind you, you weren't coming out alive.
Yo, son, let's go get this dude, son. Let's go get him. We're gonna do this dude, man. Real, yo. Yo, oh shit. Priest, what's up, man? What's up? What you doing? Oh, man. Yo, Preacher, man, come on.
Preacher told Malik he had to die. He was gaining too much influence within the organization. Preacher wouldn't tolerate it. Malik pleaded for his life, but the order had been given.
Grab the saw, son. Clean him up.
At Preacher's command, other janitors used a circular saw to dismember Malik. The informant said that Preacher ordered him and another crew member to dispose of the body parts.
This is the guy you work for, right?
They poured acid on Malik's arms to remove gang tattoos that could link him to the crew. Then they left the body parts in several crumbling, abandoned buildings.
They kept Malik's head in a refrigerator for a couple of weeks, and they kind of paraded it around on a stick. You know, that's how Preacher would, keep the fear of God, so to speak, in the younger Turks in his organization.
The fear was too much for the informant, though he knew leaving the crew was equivalent to a death sentence. He hoped the C-11 squad could protect him. It didn't take long for word to get back to the Preacher that the informant had cooperated. One day, the informant was leaving a New York courthouse when he spotted Preacher in cuff. He was sure they were there to abduct and kill him. He went to his car and called his C-11 handlers.
The informant advised me that his fear that he was going to be killed by the organization, he was going to be abducted, right in the middle of the afternoon in front of the courthouse.
The agents of C-11 rushed to stop another murder in the Preacher's territory.
I'm scared to death.
A former member of the Preacher crew feared the gang was out to kill him for cooperating with authorities. Agents and detectives from the FBI C-11 squad came to his aid just in time. They arrested Maine Lieutenant John Cuff and the crew leader himself, Clarence Preacher Heatley. Sergeant James Marr and the other arresting agents searched the vehicle.
There was evidence inside, including information about my informant, masks, tape. It was apparent at the time that my informant's feelings were right. He was going to be abducted that day.
Come on, man.
But no one could prove that the men were coming to kill the informant.
20 minutes is all it took. I told you.
The Preacher and Cuff were released.
Come on, man. I got things to do, man. Hurry up. Okay, you got some
The
glasses?
incident brought the C-11 squad's investigation of the crew into the open.
20 minutes, all it took. Have a nice day. Nice day, officer.
That's when it became apparent that they were being investigated by the FBI. I mean, here's this detective that they know from the 3-2, that when he does make an arrest, makes arrests with FBI agents. It became apparent to Cuff and Preacher that the FBI was breathing down their neck.
Preacher further insulated himself. The FBI would have to get him by going after his organization. To prosecute, they would use federal racketeering statutes known as RICO. Originally designed to bring down organized crime families, RICO requires that strict criteria are met, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
You have to have your organization, you have to have your leader, which in this case was Preacher, and he has to have 5 or more people working underneath him, to facilitate the conspiracy of the organization. But you also need 3 predicate offenses, 3 federal offenses.
The C-11 investigators surveilled the Preacher crew, gathering evidence on offenses to support the RICO case. They noticed unrest within the gang. It seemed the pressure of C-11's investigation was getting to the preacher. From an informant, agents learned he even ordered the murder of his main lieutenant, John Cuff. Agents were obligated to warn Cuff of the hit.
I reached for my shield. He goes, "I know who you are. You don't have to show me your shield." I said, "You know, John, I just wanted to let you know that there's a contract out in your life, and I swear there's nothing but space when you look in his eyes." And he goes, "Everybody wants me dead."
Cuff was undaunted by the threat. Though the preacher was tightening his grip on his men, investigators still needed to get evidence of the crimes the crew committed to support the racketeering organization. As more buyers and sellers were arrested, some agreed to cooperate, helping to outline the group in detail, according to Detective Vinnie Flynn.
We obtained the informants through narcotics investigations, arrests made by the 3-2 precinct and the 3-2 detective squad, through information they developed and informants they developed. Because of arrest, information was compiled, which built a case against the preacher crew.
About some murders. What murders do you know about?
Unfortunately, no one had information on the Donnell Porter murder.
There was this girl who went to the park, you know, and so we took her back.
But one arrested crew member offered details of another murder committed by the crew, hoping for leniency. He said they decided they didn't want to pay for a shipment of drugs. They told the supplier that a young woman had stolen them and that they would take care of her. She was a single mother who sometimes worked as a courier for the crew.
Did you see her whack?
They brought her to a Harlem apartment, telling her they wanted her to hear a record they had produced.
Look it up.
She hadn't stolen any drugs. That didn't matter to the crew. The informant explained how they cleaned up the crime scene, then dumped the body in an abandoned building. He couldn't remember exactly which building it was. In August 1996, after more than 5 years of meticulous investigation, the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York decided they had enough for indictments and arrests on federal RICO charges. The first indictment was against Clarence Preacher Heatley and John Cuff. The indictment was kept sealed. If word got out to the preacher, he might disappear forever. Investigators staked out Preacher's Harlem headquarters. They hoped news of the indictments hadn't been leaked, and that if they found him, they could arrest him without a fight. They knew Preacher was surrounded by armed men, willing to kill at his command. In late 1996, the C-11 squad was ready to arrest Clarence Preacher Heatley. No one had seen him in days. On August 12th, he emerged from his headquarters building. Detectives made sure he was alone, then moved in.
Preacher, drop the phone! Drop the phone! Drop the phone! Let me see your hands! Get on the car! Get on the car! Get on the car! Hands on the car!
As he was arrested, the elusive gang leader remained relaxed and confident. As soon as he was in custody, other teams arrested his main lieutenant, John Cuff. 2 months later, 15 more Preacher crew members were indicted. arrest teams prepared for simultaneous takedowns. They had to strike fast, full force, to arrest gang members safely. Detective Vinnie Flynn and other C-11 investigators developed more cooperating witnesses among the arrested crew members.
Once people were arrested and being prosecuted, they agreed to cooperate, and they felt that they were used by the preacher crew, and felt that if, in some cases, if they didn't participate, they would have been killed too. So this was their way out of the preacher crew and from under Clarence Heatley's control.
Investigators learned in which Harlem buildings the crew dumped some of their victims. Finding physical evidence was crucial in order to prosecute the RICO case. One building was a shell, partially collapsed on the inside, further complicating the retrieval. After days of excavating tons of rubble, a body was discovered. Lab examiners determined it was the body of the young mother who had been killed as a cover for stolen drugs. She had been shot in an apartment in an adjacent building. Evidence response teams checked the apartment.
That's the apartment where they kept Malik's head. And in the refrigerator, there was a lot of blood still left in the apartment. And inside the refrigerator, there was Malik's blood from where they kept his head. They were able to trace that at the lab.
Malik and several others had been killed in the basement of the preacher's headquarters. Crime scene technicians processed the basement. Arrested crew members said Preacher had them scrub the place with boric acid after each killing. Most of the basement was clean.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there you go.
But technicians were able to recover traces of blood on the windows and on the saw blade that had been used to dismember Malik. But the investigation was not over. The abduction and murder of young Donnell Porter was still unsolved.
Come on in, gentlemen. Have a seat.
Answers about his death finally came from an unlikely source. An assistant district attorney convinced the boys' uncle, preacher crew member John Apple Porter, to come in to talk. He was one of the crew's main players left on the street and had been labeled a snitch. 2 attempts had been made on his life. The DA suggested that Porter cooperate to earn protection in prison. He confessed to several murders and revealed what happened to his nephew Donnell. According to Sergeant James Marr, the kidnapping was prompted by jealousy and greed.
The underlying factor with Johnny Porter, Johnny Apples, with the kidnapping was when he came home from prison, Richie Porter, his nephew, was this big Harlem drug dealer. He was getting paid. Richie Porter used to wear a lot of gold, used to really like flashy cars. He was making a lot of money, and he wasn't giving any to Johnny Porter. And Johnny Porter felt he was owed this, and he decided to take it. And the way he took it is he snatched the kid.
Porter said the preacher agreed to the kidnapping. He sent one of his janitors, Malik, to help. They believed Richard Porter would pay anything to get his brother back.
No.
They kept the boy in a basement where no one would hear him.
What's up, Sean? We'll make a take for us.
They cut off his finger and recorded the boy's pleas for help to prove to his family they were serious. Apple and Preacher hoped for $500,000, enough to set Apple up in his own drug trade and enough to cripple Richard Porter.
What time was it?
When Richard couldn't come up with that amount of cash, they lowered it to $350,000.
Did you hold that in his hand?
Then the unexpected happened. preacher in Apple learned that Richard Porter was murdered, there'd be no ransom.
You sure about that? Make the call.
Preacher Heatley later told Special Agent Joe Walsh about his decision.
Our preacher sat right down in a room and told me exactly what happened. He looked me right in the eye and said, I couldn't let that boy live after what had happened.
Yeah.
John Porter insisted that it was Malik who actually did the killing. Malik was later killed and dismembered at the preacher's command.
You're gonna think twice about it.
John Porter was sentenced to natural life. Because of the evidence collected by the C-11 squad, each member of the preacher crew went to prison. Their leader, Clarence Preacher Heatley, pled guilty to federal racketeering charges that included drug trafficking, assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life with no chance of parole. He and his crew will never again terrorize the streets of Harlem.
It's estimated that they're responsible for approximately 45 murders that we're aware of. Numerous robberies. If you add the extortion in, these people were a decade-long or better crime wave in themselves. They were just amazing, the devastation that they caused in these communities.
That changed when the C-11 squad dismantled the preacher crew forever.